Thomas here with Much Props, going to give you another how-to video. Today I am building something for one of my favorite YouTubers. I was inspired by a Patreon member of mine who goes by Never Lethal Props. He sent me this knuckle duster with the Much Props on the front of it, and it's in my colors, just to say thank you. It was a truly humbling gesture, and I wanted to do the same for somebody else. So I started looking at all the content creators that I follow on YouTube, and I watch woodworkers, metalworkers, foamsmiths, street artists, traditionally trained artists. I run the gamut when it comes to creative makers. And one person came to mind in general. His name is 1000 here on YouTube. You probably have heard of him or at least seen some of his work before. I wanted to make something for him to just tell him thanks. It really does make my day when I get like an instant message or something, a comment on a video that tells me how my video had helped them in some way. I've had somebody tell me that it helped them to connect with their son and make a Halloween costume. I had somebody else tell me that they were battling cancer and it kept their mind off of having to go through all the treatments. So those stories are few and far between, but it really does energize me and want me to keep putting out content for you, because you never know who you're going to impact. So I wanted to make something for 1000 just to tell him thanks. And hopefully he'll watch this video and hopefully he'll enjoy what I make for him. He has this character that he repeats on some of his artwork that he calls a watcher. And that's what I'm going to make today. So I'm taking just a picture of one of his characters and trying to make it in a 3-dimensional sculpture using some epoxy sculpt. So that's the game plan. Let's get to building. I found 1000's channel about a year ago during the pandemic, and I really connected with his content. He takes his love of music, art, and his good sense of humor and makes some insanely entertaining videos. I found a good image of one of his watchers and used that as my only reference for the build. To make a structure for the sculpture, I started by making a frame to bulk out the body using cardboard. Instead of throwing material on top of this two intersecting shapes here, I decided to bulk out the insides of the divisions to make a solid form. From the image, the watcher looks like an upside down diamond shape to me, so I crumbled up some foil and hot glued it in between the places where you see the gaps in the cardboard. The cardboard and the foil will bulk out the base, reducing the amount of epoxy sculpt I'll have to use later, and it cuts down on the overall weight because regardless, this thing is going to be heavy. Almost looks like a unopened ginormous Hershey Kiss at this point. I glove up and start to mix the epoxy. It's an equal parts A and B mix. Just roll out close enough to equal balls and then start folding them into each other. Once it's a solid color, I'm ready to apply it to the base. You have a couple of hours to work with it before it starts to harden up a little bit, and it fully cures in 24 hours. I covered the whole thing and waited a day to put on the details. I lightly sanded the surface with some 120 grit sandpaper, busted out my bag of clay sculpting tools, mixed up another batch of epoxy, and started adding on the details. It works just like polymer clay. You can easily make shapes to stack on top of what you've already done. I used the bowl of water to help me smooth out the structure and the tools to help push the material onto the base. I formed most of the stuff by hand and then used various tools to refine the smaller details. Altogether, this part probably took about 2 or 3 hours to get it close to where I wanted, then another 24 hours to wait for curing of epoxy. To get some sharper edges in areas and blend together some of the transitions to the base a little better, I added a sanding drum to my rotary tool, put on a respirator, turned on an air ventilation, and did some rough sanding. This sanding drum is, I think, 80 grit, so it makes quick work of it. If you're wondering why parts are darker, I ran out of the light gray and had to open up some fresh epoxy buckets for the facial features. I didn't know if 1000 ever drew the backside of the watchers. I didn't see it really in any of his work that I've seen, so I just put a seam on the back of the mask area to fill up the blank space. Yep, more sanding. With the bulk of the transition knocked out, I started working my way down the grits, starting with 120, then 220, and then finishing with a 320 grit. The goal with sanding is to remove the scratches of the previous grits. The bigger the number on the grit, the smoother the surface area on your build gets. I think I spent as much time sanding as I did sculpting. Still kind of a noob at sculpting and definitely need to practice a little more. Two coats of primer with sanding between them to make a smooth watcher. Skin got some blue/tealish transition colors, and then the mask part started with a dark orange at the bottom and worked my way up to yellow towards the top. To bring in the other colors, I switch over to some Platifix acrylic paint and hand paint the rest of it. Kind of hard to get into some of the areas, but I managed to push the paint in there without too much frustration. $1000 has this black line aesthetic on most of his artwork, so I figured I needed to add it to my sculpt. On a three-dimensional surface that I'm trying to match to the reference you see here, it's almost kind of like cell shading. I try to match marks where I can, but have to thicken areas and kind of wing it in other areas because of the angles and the thickness of the things that I've sculpted. I really like using the acrylic paint pens for this instead of brushes because I feel like I have more control due to the stiff tip. Once done, I give it a clear coat to protect my paint job. I decided to add a little cushion on the bottom of the sculpt with some EVA foam, just so it's not scraping up against anything that it may be on, and so it doesn't crack up the paint that's on my sculpt. Instead of just a plain bottom, I used my Glowforge to engrave a little thank you message into the foam for $1000. Once it was done, I super glued it onto the bottom, and this build is done. And we are finished. Here is the end result. I think it turned out all right. Hopefully he does too. 1000 likes to use very contrasting colors, like oranges and teals in his art. So I thought I would definitely mimic that with the color here and kind of stick to my reference image that I used. I think it turned out pretty awesome. It is very weighty, which I definitely could have used other materials to do so. And then putting that little thank you on the bottom of it just to kind of tell him how I felt and how he inspired me to do stuff. So here's where I would typically tell you, ask him how you made that, but instead I'm going to ask you to do this. I want you to find your favorite YouTubers. You don't have to make them something. You don't have to mail them something, but just send them a comment. Leave them a reply down in the comments below their video, telling them how something they've done has helped you in some way. Instant message them if you don't want to put it out there for everybody to read, but reach out to your content creators and let them know that the time they spend on these videos to entertain is definitely well worth it. I know from personal experience that watching videos like 1000s and a bunch of other people that I follow, it definitely keeps me creative. It keeps me looking for new ways to do things, and it just gives me an overall sense of creativity. It keeps me from just being complacent and being in that comfort zone and stepping outside of it. And let your content creators know how much you appreciate them, how much you enjoy the stuff that they do. I'm gonna mail this to 1000. Hopefully he gets it and it stays in one piece and he enjoys what I did with his character and is not completely appalled by what I did. But yeah, inevitably somebody's gonna ask you, how'd you make that? You can give them one of these, tell them much props. Kind of looks like he may want to give you a little sugar. Thanks to my Patreon members for continuing to support the channel. If you would like to join these awesome people and help me grow a bigger, better, more creative community, consider joining them. Links to my Patreon in the description below.